Welcome back to another episode of Mike Reads. Today, we'll be continuing in our series on Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies with our third read in Chapter 3, entitled Male-Female Facts and Fallacies. This chapter is broken up into several sections. The section that we will be reading today is entitled Employer Discrimination. That is further broken down into other subsections. I'll let you know when we get to those subsections, and I'll put a timestamp in this video's description so that you can just jump to the subsection breaks if you'd like. I'll also be putting a timestamp in this video's description to the analysis and review part of the video. So if you would prefer to just skip right to the analysis and review part of the video, which we will be doing as part of this series, which I've explained before, you can do that. Also, as I've explained as part of this series is being done as a parallel read with Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. So I'll put a link in this video's description to that series so you guys can follow that as well if you'd like. So without further ado, let's dive into Chapter 3, Male-Female Facts and Fallacies, with the third section, Employer Discrimination. Equally as important as determining how much discrimination exists is determining where it occurs and what the economic incentives and constraints are. People who discriminate against girls when it comes to education pay no price for that, but employers who discriminate against women workers do. If employers pay a woman only 3/4 as much as they would pay a man for doing the same work with the same skill, this means that those employers who hire an all-female workforce can get 4 workers for what other employers are paying for 3. Smaller production cost differences than that can mean that some companies prosper while some other competing companies go out of business because their high production costs prevent them from selling profitably at competitive prices. Even if discriminatory employers do not think things through this way, the competition of the marketplace will tend to force the higher cost producers out of business, whether they understand why or not. Much discussion of employer discrimination against women has focused on employer beliefs or attitudes which could lead to such discrimination. However, as in the case of racial and ethnic minorities, the employer's beliefs or attitudes are not the only factor, nor necessarily the most important factor in determining what actually happens. The more highly competitive the market for labor and for the employer's products, the higher the cost paid for discrimination, and consequently the less leeway the employer has for indulging his prejudices without risking his own profits and ultimately the financial survival of his business. On the other hand, enterprises not subject to the full stress of a competitive market, monopolies, nonprofit enterprises, government agencies, have greater leeway. The empirical question of how much employer discrimination there is and how much of the male-female income gap it explains requires comparing comparable people and comparable situations. Simple as that may seem, it is seldom simple in practice. Where a particular job involves contact with the customers or clientele of an employer, the prejudices or biases of these people outside the firm itself can become incentives for the employer to discriminate, which must then be weighed against the costs of discrimination. In times past, some people had less confidence in the professional ability of a female attorney or doctor, or else just felt more comfortable dealing with men in roles where they were accustomed to dealing with men. In any event, the question before the employer was not whether these feelings were justified, but how widespread they were, and therefore whether adding a woman would help or hurt a private medical practice or a given law firm, even if the woman were fully as qualified as the men currently employed. In short, there are economic incentives both for and against discrimination, and the net balance of their effects is an empirical question. So are the effects of other factors. Alternative explanations of male-female differences can be tested against empirical evidence, not only for the present but also for the past, especially when considering changing male-female income ratios over time and the changing representation of women in various professions. Comparability. In order to determine the existence or magnitude of sex discrimination by employers, as distinguished from other sex discrimination which may have occurred in education or domestic differences between the sexes which affect job choice, we must compare women and men who have similar education, skills, job experience, and other relevant characteristics. Many statistics on male-female income differences do not do this, but simply make gross comparisons of women and men in general as groups, either without regard to comparability or with very limited attempts to hold the differing variables constant. Thus, a study in Britain found that women as a group earned 17% less per hour than men when both worked full-time. However, this same study found that the pay differential was not due to women and men being paid different wages or salaries for doing the same job, but that women took lower paying jobs more often than men, especially after returning to the labor force after having children. As young beginning workers, British women's incomes were 91% of that of British men, but as mothers, their incomes were just 67% of that of men who were fathers. Mothers' incomes declined as a percentage of male incomes more or less steadily until about a dozen years after giving birth, when it began to rise again, though never getting back to where it was before a child was born, perhaps indicating the permanent income loss due to interrupted careers. In the United States, a study of graduates of the University of Michigan Law School found a similar pattern. Quote, "The gap in pay between women and men was relatively small at the outset of their careers, but 15 years later, women graduates earned only 60% as much as men. Some of this difference reflected choices which workers had made, including the propensity of women lawyers to work shorter hours." End quote. Attempting to control simultaneously for part-time versus full-time employment and for the effect of children and domestic responsibilities, another study found, quote, that the gender pay gap is 5% for part-time workers aged 21 to 35 without children, under 3% for full-time workers aged 21 to 35 without children, and that there is no pay gap for full-time workers aged 21 to 35 living alone, end quote. All these gaps represent the upper limit of the effect of employer discrimination plus whatever other factors might favor men, such as differences in education and in occupations involving physical strength or dangers. That the income gaps between women and men are so small, without even taking these other factors into account, suggests that employer discrimination by itself has far less influence on the gross income gaps between the sexes than gross statistics might suggest. While comparing truly comparable individuals is something that must also be done when trying to determine the existence or effect of discrimination against ethnic or racial groups, achieving similar comparability between women and men is more challenging. That's because while such factors as education and experience affect different racial or ethnic groups the same way, that is, blacks with more education earn more than blacks with less education, just as among whites, even if not to the same extent, the same factors can have opposite effects on women and men. As we have already noted, marriage and parenthood tend to lead to increased incomes for men and reduced incomes for women. Nor are single women and single men comparable when single people include people who have been married for years and have been divorced. That is because the long-term negative economic effects of marriage on women, such as the interruption or even cessation of full-time employment, do not disappear with a change in marital status and re-entering the labor force with less experience than men of the same age. By the same token, the beneficial economic effects of marriage for men do not disappear completely after a divorce, since past seniority and increased job skills continue to make the man a higher earner than a man who was never married, or a woman who was never married. To get comparability among people of both sexes who have not had their incomes affected by marriage means comparing women and men who were, quote-unquote, never married, rather than simply, quote-unquote, single. For purposes of separating out the effects of marriage, and the asymmetrical domestic arrangements which marriage often creates from the effects of employer discrimination, the most comparable women and men are those who were never married. If male-female income gaps remain large among women and men who were never married, then obviously the economic effects of marriage do not explain sex differences in income. But if that differential changes substantially according to marital status and parenthood, then the employer is correspondingly less of a factor in income differences between women and men. What are the facts? As already noted, comparing never married women and men who are past the childbearing years and who both work full-time in the 21st century shows women of this description earning more than men of the same description. As far back as 1969, academic women who had never married earned more than academic men who had never married, while married academic women without children earned less, and married academic women with children earned still less. For women in general, that is, not just academic women, those single women who had worked continuously since high school were in 1971 earning slightly more than men of the same description. All this was before affirmative action was defined as quote-unquote underrepresentation in a 1971 executive order, which went into effect in 1972, and so represents what was happening under competitive labor market pressures before any major government intervention to advance women. Both trends over time and studies of women at given times show the same pattern of a negative correlation between marital responsibilities, including children, and women's educational levels and career advancement. Whether in the earlier or the later era, women who were married and had children lagged furthest behind men in income, career advancement, or even working at all. A study published in 1956 showed that most women with PhDs from Radcliffe were not working full-time, and those who were averaged fewer children than those who worked part-time, intermittently, or not at all. In gross terms, that is, ignoring differences between the sexes in continuous versus discontinuous employment, career choices, or full-time versus part-time employment, etc., the ratio of female to male incomes in the general population remained relatively unchanged at about 60% during the decades of the 1960s and 1970s, and then began to rise significantly from the early 1980s, reaching 70% in 1990 and 77% in 2004. Finer breakdowns of the data to compare women and men of comparable ages, education, and employment histories showed the sexes much closer in earnings. Merely comparing full-time, year-round workers showed women's pay to be 81% of men's pay in 2005. Part-time workers not only earn less total pay, they are also paid less per hour and are less likely to be promoted. There have been, and continue to be, more women than men who are part-time workers. Very substantial income differences between women and men in a particular field can coexist with little or no income differences between women and men who are comparable within that field. For example, a study published in the New England Journal of Medicine found, quote, in 1990, young male physicians earned 41% more per year than young female physicians. However, after adjusting for differences in specialty, practice setting, and other characteristics, no earnings difference was evident, end quote. The young male physicians in this study worked over 500 hours a year more than the young female physicians. In general, it makes a difference whether the male-female income gap is compiled on an annual basis, a monthly basis, or as per-hour earnings. Since women tend to work fewer hours than men, the largest gap tends to be in annual income and the smallest in per-hour pay. For example, the U.S. Department of Labor has reported weekly male-female earnings differences, showing women's earnings to be 76.5% of that of men in 1999, for example, but women's hourly earnings were 83.8% of that of men in the same year. Comparing women and men who were comparable in occupation, industry, and other variables, the per-hour difference shrank to 6.2 cents. While there are factors tending to reduce the male-female income gap over time, there are other factors tending to widen it. For example, as job experience becomes more important in the economy and more highly rewarded, this tends to widen the gap between men's income and women's incomes. Since women of a given age tend to have less job experience than men of the same age. Shifts in demand from one industry to another and from one occupation to another also affect male-female income gaps, since women and men continue to form different proportions of the workforce in different industries and occupations. Moreover, these proportions have changed over time. Nearly half of female college graduates in 1960 became teachers, while less than 10% did so by 1990. The net effect of conflicting trends on male-female earnings differentials makes explanations of their income differences far from easy. Although the male-female income gap has generally been declining over time since the 1960s, within a given lifetime that gap tends to widen. That is, young women tend to have earnings closer to the earnings of young men than older women's earnings compared to older men. What happens in between is that women's labor force participation rates are affected by domestic and especially child-rearing responsibilities. A study in the American Economic Review showed, quote, in March 2001, at ages 25 to 44, the prime period for career development, 34% of women with children under the age of 6 were out of the labor force, compared to 16% of women without children. 30% of employed mothers worked part-time compared to 11% of women with no children. Among men, however, the presence of children is associated with an increase in work involvement. Only 4% of men with children under the age of 6 are out of the labor force, and among employed fathers, only 2% work part-time. End quote. In short, having children has major effects on labor force participation rates and opposite effects on women and men. Although younger women are of course more likely to have children, it is older women whose job qualifications have been most affected by the accumulated differences in job experience from that of men of similar ages. This difference is reflected in the wider male-female earnings gap in the older years. All this is primarily relevant to the notion of a quote-unquote glass ceiling restricting how high women are allowed to rise, especially in top management positions. These are positions usually reached after many years of experience. Empirically, the gaps between women and men are huge in both representation among high-level executives and in incomes at the executive levels, but shrink dramatically when comparing women and men of comparable experience, including continuous experience with a given company. For example, only about 2.4% of top-level management positions were filled by women, according to a study in the Industrial and Labor Relations Review, and, quote, the gender gap in compensation among top executives was at least 45%, end quote. Part of the reason for the compensation gap was that women were more likely to be executives in smaller corporations, whose executives tend to be paid less than executives in the largest corporations. And part of the reason for women being executives in smaller corporations is that this reflects their lesser experience. Taking these and other differences into account shrinks the male-female compensation gap considerably. Quote, women in the sample were much younger and had much less seniority in their company than men. Part of the effect of age and seniority on the gender gap seems to be reflected in the size of companies women managed. All in all, we find that the unexplained gender compensation gap for top executives was less than 5% after one accounts for all observable differences between women and men. End quote. Despite the complexities revealed by a closer examination of statistical data, lawsuits continue to be filed, claiming discrimination based on purely numerical differences in the economic situations of women and men. As the New York Times reported in 2007, quote, in the lawsuit, the lead plaintiff, a former assistant store manager who is upset about not being made a store manager, asserts that Costco discriminated against women in promotions because 13% of the company's store managers were women, while nearly half of its employees were women. End quote. This lawsuit was by no means unique. A similar claim was made against Walmart in 2004, likewise based on statistical disparities. Back in 1973, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission filed a sex discrimination lawsuit against Sears based solely on statistical disparities rather than on any woman who claimed that a man of lower qualifications than her own was hired or promoted when she was not. Yet this case went on for years, until it was finally decided in 1988 by the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, which pointed out that the EEOC had failed to come up with even, quote, anecdotal evidence of discriminatory employment practices, quote, or end quote, or any, quote, flesh and blood victims of discrimination, end quote. The court pointed out that the EEOC, quote, did not present in evidence even one specific instance of discrimination, end quote, in a company with hundreds of stores from coast to coast. Sears won that case, but its legal victory obviously did not stop sex discrimination lawsuits against other companies based on statistical disparities. Employers who were not as large as Sears were in no financial position to fight a federal lawsuit for 15 years and spend the $20 million that Sears spent defending this case, might well be forced to agree to a consent decree that would brand them in the public mind as guilty of sex discrimination. Moreover, the spread of cases like that, settled by employers not able to afford the cost of fighting through the courts for years, would be enough to convince many observers that sex discrimination was widespread and was the primary source of male-female economic differences. The minority analogy. Many have analogized the situation of women to that of low-income minorities, explaining income disparities in both cases by employer discrimination and attempting through anti-discrimination laws and affirmative action policies to advance both groups economically. But there are fundamental differences between the circumstances of women and those of minorities which affect both analysis and policy. As already noted, in analyzing the economic situation of minorities, it is possible to get some idea of how much of the income disparities between minorities and the general population is explained by various factors besides employer discrimination by comparing individuals who are comparable in age, education, and other relevant factors. But while more education, for example, raises the income of both blacks and whites, even if not to the same degree, one of the biggest factors in income differences between women and men, parenthood, has opposite effects on their incomes. Comparing married women with married men does not mean comparing individuals who are comparably affected. Only the never married women and men are in comparable circumstances, and here women have had comparable or higher incomes than men years before there were laws or government policies against sex discrimination. Women and minorities are different in a more fundamental historical sense. Low-income minorities are usually descendants of poorer and less educated people, so that they inherit both a cultural and an economic background that is less helpful to them in trying to rise economically and socially than are the backgrounds of other members of society. Women, however, are not descended just from women. Whatever educational or economic advantages men had in the past, those men were their fathers and grandfathers just as much as the women were their mothers and grandmothers. Today's generation of women inherit whatever advantages their male forebears had as much as they inherit whatever disadvantages their female forebears had, and so do the brothers of today's women. Obvious as this may seem, it is often ignored by those making analogies between women and minorities. One sign of the difference is that female PhDs have long come from higher socioeconomic backgrounds than male PhDs and have had higher test scores, just the opposite of the situation among blacks and other low-income minorities. In the academic world, the history and present circumstances of women and minorities are especially different. First of all, female academics have been common for far longer than black academics, reaching a peak proportion of all academics back in 1879 that was not equaled again in the next 90 years. Black professors and administrators were rare in the 19th century, even in colleges for black students. Although an early set of federal guidelines on affirmative action asserted that, quote, women and minorities are often not in word-of-mouth channels of recruitment, end quote, for academic positions, that is certainly not true of women. Women with doctorates have for years received those degrees from prestigious institutions about as often as men have, so that they have long been in the so-called, quote-unquote, good old boy network of academic recruitment, just like male PhDs. That concludes the read for today. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So this is actually going to be fairly short because basically all Thomas Sowell does in this chapter is he makes the empirical case. So we talked about in the previous chapter how he was starting to build the methods, if you will, for talking about the scientific method, and then he was going to perform the testing. And in the next section, we'll be reading his summary, which will be a nice short read for us. So in the previous chapter, I suggested that he probably could have dotted that chapter with a little bit more of the how do we get from these independent variable controls to their actual effect on the hypothesis at question, which is that there is some sort of systemic race, gender discrimination of some sort, which explains the entirety of the quote-unquote gender pay gap. So in this case, he bombards you. He beats you over the head with the actual raw data, which brings you towards that conclusion. And in doing so, in making that leap, in just 8 pages, he winds up with 23 citations for his empiricism. And this, to me, this is one of my favorite parts of the read because he gets into such pedantic detail about the empiricism. So he didn't really need to go to this extent to actually prove the case, but he's the kind that, and I like this about him, that Sowell is the type that likes to beat you over the head with these statistics so that it makes it painfully obvious what's going on. And by providing multiple sources, it sounds like he's not just cherry picking one source, and jumping to his own conclusion based on that one source of empirical control. The other thing that he brings up in this chapter, because that's basically the whole point of the chapter, is to make the empirical leap from the hypothesis to the conclusion. The other thing that he talks about in this chapter is that he makes the point about independent variable control on page 75 that I've been making for some time now, which is that when you have the gross statistic, you need to do independent variable control. You can't just say that this is what I think this thing is, and I'm not going to do any independent variable control, so conclusion. That's part of the scientific method, FYI, party of science. So you need to be doing these sort of things. He beats you over the head with the fact that you need to compare comparable people. And the only way you can create comparable people is to do this independent variable control. If we're looking again at height and basketball players, there are a lot of things that you could control for to see what effect height it has on the game. Athleticism might be something to control for. A number of hours of practice might be something to control for. So, this is something that's just built into the scientific method, and it's something that if you're trying to support a narrative, as he talks about in others of his books, and when intellectuals want to just support a narrative, they don't bother with these independent variable controls. One of the other things I love about this chapter is that he leads with what I call a proof. I'll link in this video's description to a video we talked about and the difference between evidence and proof. So in this chapter, he provides an empirical claim, and he conducts empiricism to evidence the claim. He also provides a proof for the claim, which I love, and that comes on page 73. And that it starts on page 73 and continues on into page 74. And that's the idea that if there really is, if employers really are getting away with taking women in for the exact same work in the exact same position for the exact same person, you're getting away with paying women less, then what you'll find is that the all-women workforces, the companies that say, I'm going to go ahead and hire only women, create what's called a competitive advantage. And when you create a competitive advantage, that the market response to that is to basically give you all of the transactions. So in the case of a company that, say, hires only women, they're going to have a competitive advantage. And if they make use of that competitive advantage by, say, lowering their prices, then everyone's just going to go to them. Unless you're working in a market with no elasticity. We'll have to talk about elasticity at some point. There are markets that experience basically no price elasticity. And almost all of them are experience no price demand elasticity because of a governmental protection. But we'll get into that maybe in another series of reads. And the thing is that he explains how even if women are being paid, say, 75 cents on the dollar, even if you can get away with paying women 3/4 of the amount, it's not that what you're going to find is a reduction of men by 33% in the workforce. You're going to find a reduction to basically zero, because that company that hires only women is now going to have that competitive advantage. And they don't even need to know why that competitive advantage exists. The market doesn't even need to know why that competitive advantage exists. They just need to know that the prices are lower. By the way, this is how you efficiently allocate scarce resources, with prices. That's how you do it, with prices. And he explains this fact that it's not going to work out to 33%, Bosh, because there isn't a one-to-one comparison of the comparative advantage that's created by this competitive advantage. This begins on page 73. Even if discriminatory employers do not think things through this way, the competition of the marketplace will tend to force the higher cost producers out of business, whether they understand why or why not. And what this means, because he's provided this proof, is that we really don't need to do the empiricism, but Sowell does it anyways. And again, this is why I consider him to be, this is why I really like his writing, and I really like his writing style. And I really like the way he does it, especially in this book. Again, I've done a review of this book. You know what? I'll put a link in this video description to my review of this book too, because I'm going to probably have to do an update as I'm doing this series. So the question that you might have for this chapter is then, well, why does the myth still persist? Sowell actually explains this on page 75. I have done I'm in the middle of a philosophical concepts series on my other channel. So when Hanlon's Razor comes out, I'll put a link to that in this video's description. But in this case, he's not actually speaking to their intentions, but Sowell does explain why this myth still persists. Many statistics on male-female income differences do not do this, the independent variable control, but simply make gross comparisons of women and men in general as groups. And then he goes on to say about the independent variable controls, either without regard to comparability or with very limited attempts to hold the differing variables constant. Again, Vosh. So in this way, in this chapter, he's made the empirical claim. He's performed, this is, if we're going through the scientific method, this is the testing period of the hypothesis that there is this nefarious gender pay gap. And then, he's gone through his methods in the previous sections of this chapter. He's gone through his introduction and the hypothesis in the even more previous sections of this chapter. And now he's brought forth the actual testing and basically has brought us to the results of the testing. The next section of the chapter will be the summary, and that'll be his conclusions to the chapter. So I think he's done a pretty good job of fairly thoroughly debunking the gender pay gap myth. And I will put a link in this video's description to my series on discrimination and discrimination and disparities, or is it disparities and discrimination? Discrimination and disparities. It's definitely that, which is another book by Thomas Sowell that we read on this channel. So I'll put a link to that in this video's description, where he goes into much greater detail on how if you just look at the disparity, if you just look at the results and the outcome, you haven't actually looked at the necessary causes of that outcome. And if you're just jumping to the conclusion that it must be discrimination, again, you're not conducting the scientific method. You must conduct, if you're testing the results, you must involve yourself in some independent variable control. So he goes into further detail on that effect in that book, specifically on the pay gap, but on other topics as well. So that's a really interesting read. I thought that was a great read. I think that's one of his better works, actually, and I think he's a great writer anyway. So go ahead and check that out if you're interested. And like I said, in the next read, we'll finish off chapter 3 with a very short read on the on Thomas Sowell's summary. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.